Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here and thanks for checking out my podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for new episodes. You can also find Shine Without Shame on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Today, my guest is Chuck Egerton. Chuck works to design, direct, and accompany arts-based photographic dialogue projects, seeking the authentic noble self and human connection in alignment with the teachings of the Baha'i Faith. Most recently, Chuck has been exploring and contesting the intersection of patriarchy and whiteness. He is an educator, photographer, and peace and conflict studies, or PACS, practitioner, trained and experienced as a visual artist and in the art of conflict transformation and racial healing. His BFA is from the Maryland Institute College of Art. His MA in Peace and Conflict Studies, PACS, is from UNC Greensboro, and his PhD in PACS is from the University of Manitoba. Born into a white and male body, Chuck is in a constant struggle to decolonize himself from the ideologies of whiteness and patriarchy and embrace his God-given human nobility. Chuck, I'm so happy you're here with me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's wonderful to be with you. Thanks.
Lovely. Well, I thought we could start by sharing how and when we met, because it's been
hmm
sort of in the recent past that we've met.
Yeah, I think it was January, I think, when we
Mm-hmm.
first met. Yeah. Yeah, we and we're speaking coast to coast today. I'm in Asheboro, North Carolina, way across. And this is where we started it's a book study on Bell Hook's Will to Change, and it's called The New Understanding of Masculinity, Contesting Patriarchy and Whiteness. So we're looking kind of at the juncture of those two oppressions and looking at their similarities, their overlaps, as we read through this wonderful book by Bell Hooks. And so that's where we first met. So glad that you are a part of it. We're almost finished. We have, I think, one more meeting. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
it's been a great experience. Well, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, the concept or the conflict sometimes
mhm.
um, that you shared with me about your maleness and your whiteness being, I guess, would you say constructs, or how would you
Yeah.
articulate them?
Yeah. I think the way, and I'm continuously working on this language, to try to refine it. But I would say I was not born white. I was whited.
Hmm.
I was not born hyper masculine. I was gendered.
Yeah.
And I think I look at myself. I try to imagine a time before uh, whiteness was kind of dropped on me, as Malcolm X once said. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. It landed on us. I feel in a way that whiteness as a construct of white supremacy landed on me. And when you're a child, you have no choice. There it is. And we also have no choice into what kind of a body we're born. That's another thing. I think there's a lot of learning in the bodies that we end up in. Because I consider myself essentially a spiritual being, and that the body is a temporary vehicle for my journey. And so I have to contemplate, why is it that I've been born into this particular kind of body, this light-skinned European body, and as a man too, and what is there for me to learn in terms of my spiritual growth from those things?
Right.
hmm
It's interesting too, because I think what you just shared sparked this thought that is not a new idea. You know about this and many others, of course.
hmm
The
hmm
idea that our ancestors all had dark skin. Our
Yes,
ancestors all
yes,
came
yes.
from one continent,
hmm hmm
Africa, and it is interesting that the evolution has almost brought us into the evolution of humanity and humans, immigrating all over the world
Hmm. Hmm.
and creating new cultures as a
Hmm.
result, that has also created entirely within cultures different mindsets of
Hmm.
values of life in a sense.
Hmm.
There is sometimes uh, just a different way of looking at life or the world simply
Hmm.
based on where you and your ancestors have lived for
Hmm.
thousands of years. So it's just
Right.
interesting that it's not a simple thing to think
Hmm.
about.
Hmm.
It's an incredible process, but
Right.
we all started
Hmm.
I presumably looking very, very similar, but it's just been a matter of, time and what time has then created
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
people in their
Yeah.
identities.
Right. And then, of course, we've been exploited and colonized through these identities. And that's what whiteness as a concept was created to oppress black people. That was its purpose, was to oppress and to commoditize black people.
And would you
And
say that it's Black people only, or would you say just essentially anybody who was not white?
anyone, and that's why whiteness as a definition was so important. And actually, it's a legal definition. Been reading an article called "Whiteness as Property," and just goes through the legal over the time we've been on this continent, how the laws have basically held up whiteness as a piece of property. And if you didn't have whiteness, of course, you lost out, right? And so it was primarily that line of demarcation between those who felt that they were superior and those who were inferior and therefore could be treated either either by being enslaved or by being killed off and pushed to the west as indigenous people were. So it's important for me to to own up to that those facts in my heritage and in my among my ancestors. And I know it's excuse me, it's easy for people to say, well, whites to say, well, I didn't hold slaves, and I can say, I'm really only a second generation American. My grandmother and grandfather came from Ireland and Wales to here, so I could easily just say that. But Ireland and Wales were also involved in the slave trade, big time. So this is a worldwide there's a worldwide effect to it. So it's important to own up to those things, but at the same time not be paralyzed by it. I acknowledge those things, and I also acknowledge the not just the history of it, but the complicity I have today, and that the privileges and the entitlements and even the financial status that I have now is still a result of the effects of slavery. And to own up to that and to think about what can I do to turn that around, and maybe this leads us a little bit to issues of shame and and guilt, because it's something that we have to own up to. And I think feeling shame about it is not a bad thing. To feel a sense of shame if it doesn't paralyze you. Because I think it can be paralyzing. And I wrote. Is it okay if I read you my haiku?
Yes, please
Okay.
do.
Okay. I wrote this morning. I wrote Tiffany this haiku. My shame arises in the wide chasm between my truth and my lies. And I think this is what I'm talking about here, trying to address is, I know I'm a noble human creature that the Creator has made, and yet my life has been permeated with lies and been lied to from the start, really. Some people have even described what happens, the whitening process is what I'm talking about, how I was whitened as child abuse. It's been described as a form of child abuse in the sense that children have no defense against what they're taught or not taught, what the behaviors that their parents model for them or don't model for them. And then there's this great fear, and this parallels itself with patriarchy, I believe, too. There's this fear of being abandoned and being left outside the group. So if you don't conform to whiteness, if you don't conform to patriarchy, then you're not a part of us and you're pushed away. And that is one of the worst human fears, I think, is to be alone, to be disowned from the group, especially when you don't know that there may be another group that you could go to that would embrace you for those beliefs, for believing in oneness rather than in division and in that one group is superior to another. So there is a degree of guilt and shame in recognizing the disconnect, the dissonance between how I know that I've been created and how these behaviors and these ideas, ideologies have just permeated me, that I have to really weed out. Have to get out.
Yes. This is interesting. I have
Mm-hmm.
a few questions.
Okay.
Now, I would you share a little bit more about when you said the child abuse or the whitening as a child? Like what are, if you would share even an example, what does that look like? What is that experience like?
Um,
What was it like for you?
well, I think, of course, this child abuse, because we are all racialized. We are raced, we could say, in terms every person, whether you're of light skin or dark skin, is raced in our society and have to conform to really the structure of white supremacy. So I think we could say it's child abuse across the board. I think for whites, though, it's maybe not looked at too much because we tend to not want to really see the oppressor as the victim, right? There's a reluctance to do that. Although the oppressor is a victim. The oppressor is a victim. And recently, I've been reading Paulo Freire, the Brazilian activist and philosopher who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he speaks about this, and he says that the oppressor cannot liberate himself or herself. The oppressor cannot do that. The oppressor has to do this in combination with the oppressed, because the oppressor doesn't have the skills to do it, so it has to be done together. There has to be a liberating process, because again, the oppressed can't be liberated without the oppressor being liberated. It's a mutual process, and it reminds me of that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. That same kind of idea Audre Lorde said.
Right.
So it's important, I think. So you ask specifically about child abuse, and I think the way I was abused as a child is that I didn't ever see black people. I didn't see any person of color except a woman who I loved, who cleaned the house once a week. She came, and I used to study her very closely because she was so different than anybody I knew. So part of my abuse was the system of white supremacy and segregation. And I grew up in Connecticut, in Greenwich, Connecticut. There were no black people. I didn't really meet black people until high school. Pretty much is when I first had interactions, and most of those were children of domestics. Interesting, because in this rather very elite place of Greenwich, Connecticut, just an hour from Manhattan, the people of color were domestic workers, usually serving the white families in the elite and very wealthy white families. And I must note, my family was pretty blue collar. we grew up. My dad was a house painter and a wallpaper hanger, but that didn't mean I didn't have racism taught to me. I mean, it didn't exclude me from all of that because I went to the schools. I was with the other kids. I didn't go to private schools, but so just the separation and just the fact that as a child, and all of my textbooks, where were black people? There were no people of color in my textbooks. Maybe there was some talk about indigenous people, but of course those were people we got out of here really quickly and pushed them west.
Mm.
You would hear, in New England there still are a lot of stories about massacres, and you would hear about issues that had occurred in the first contact, with Europeans coming to this continent. But that was always seen like I was totally clueless as I grew up that there were still indigenous people alive.
Hmm.
I just I don't think I'm alone in this. No one ever said there are still indigenous people and tribes in Connecticut. There are tribes
Mm.
and reservations to this day. So um, so I think it was in the exclusion of that worldview that I feel a sense of abuse. And there wasn't in my family. I mean, there were some very overt. Uh, there was language that was used that was very overt and against people of color. And I do remember one time my mother saying we were driving through town, and my mother said we saw a black family on the street corner, and my mother said you should be very grateful that you weren't born black.
Oh, wow.
My mother said that to us, and so you would think that came from wherever that came from in her. So obviously, she thought that was something that we should know as kids, but it's like no, that
Mm-hmm.
was abuse too. I mean, in terms of um, setting me apart, or basically putting down black people and saying, so yeah, so that's in a sense. But I think also there were times, and it didn't really face me directly, but in my wife's family, where um, her sister wanted to date a black boy in high school, and the reaction of the family to that was just horrible, just devastating. So she faced, the wrath of her parents over that, and it was, and it affected her entire life. It still does. We were talking about child abuse, and you were asking about examples of that. And the book that I'm reading is called Learning to be White by Thandeka, a black Unitarian minister. It's a brilliant book, and it's one of the only books I've seen that delves into the kind of whitening process, and that is her term that talks about whitening, and really gets in and underneath the sense of it gets into the guilt and shame that whites feel over how many poor whites were used by rich whites in the whole process of slavery and white supremacy. And we still see that process today, where um, it's often very strange to see people who vote and support political candidates who are and it candidates that don't really seem to serve their best interests is poor people. Like you wonder why would you be doing that.
Mm-hmm.
For example, she talked about a George Wallace rally that was in Michigan or Wisconsin, and the audience they were all immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they totally bought into George Wallace's racist ideology that they were losing their jobs to people of color, that their identity as white people was being diminished, and they just totally bought into this. And but there are like very few people in those states, at least in Wisconsin. I think there are very few black people living there, and there were no issues of jobs being taken or anything, but they just identified with this idea somehow. So I think the abuse affects us because of, as I said before, because of the exclusion of truth from our lives. But I also think, and I've talked to other dear friends who have gone through the suffering of being told, you can't play with my children because you're black. You can't come to our house. Making friends in school and then being told by the child having the white child having to tell their new black friend, I'm sorry, my mom said you can't come to my house. So you think about what that does to the psyche of kids, and that may not be as prevalent today as it has been in the past, but there are other forms of that go on, forms of exclusion, forms of superiority that subtly are conveyed by parents. And, parents are, they're conforming to what they thought was the way things should be by their parents. They were taught
Right.
these things by their parents. So it's a cycle of abuse, I think. I think it's an accurate term to think of. And white people have to find an exit from all this. And this is something, I've been thinking about lately, is what is the exit from whiteness? Because there was a time before I was white, and there can be a time after I'm white. I think white isn't just, and of course my skin isn't really white. It's really kind of pink or whatever. It's the whole concept of white is not about our skin color so much as it's about a construct, a social construct that is designed to make white or light-skinned people feel superior and to aid us in suppressing people of color.
When you talk about exiting whiteness
Mm-hmm.
and also about the shame and guilt
Mm-hmm.
that, at least in America, I'm sure many white people feel and experience, I I can't help but think about, and I think I might have shared this idea with you, a concern that I have about white fragility as
Mm-hmm.
a concept.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about your thoughts because I understand what you're saying. I understand absolutely that there is a consciousness, a new consciousness that is necessary, and not for white people
Mm-hmm.
to hold, but it's not just. I don't see it just as like a punishment. I
Mm-hmm.
really see it as whatever it looks like for different people,
Mm-hmm.
like individually, whatever that new consciousness is. In my mind, it's not about punishing yourself so much as, and not that you were saying that or using those words,
Mm-hmm.
but it's about what is it that allows me to feel like I'm valued, and everyone I see around me, I see them as valuable and as
Mm-hmm.
a part of, my community or my country, where we all can move forward together and feel valued, feel like we are making contributions that are
Mm-hmm.
meaningful. So I think about when I hear white fragility, or when I hear white people talk about guilt and shame, and you were using this interesting idea of exiting, the idea of exiting whiteness. I wonder, well, but what does that look like? What does that look like? Because I just get concerned that white people will be on this like hamster wheel of white fragility for like 30 years. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for me, there's got
Mm-hmm.
to be a balance of changing consciousness, right? That really embraces probably something that feels just more about oneness, or more in a way that makes us feel connected as opposed to divided, but then taking the steps to move forward as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
just kind of always
Mm-hmm.
ruminating. I mean, maybe that's not what white people are doing, but I get
Mm-hmm.
concerned that that is the trap. I think of
Mm-hmm.
it as this like hamster wheel. It's like, great. I'm so happy that like you're wanting to get conscious or wake up
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is that you're doing. But like, it can't just be about thinking about it, and like
Mm-hmm.
ruminating about it. It's
No.
got to be about taking action and moving forward. And
Mm-hmm.
that's going to look different for everybody. I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
what your thoughts are about that, and for yourself in particular. Obviously, you
Mm-hmm.
can't speak for every white person and what
No,
their
no, no.
process is going to look like. But do you get the spirit of what I'm saying
I
in terms
I
of my
I
concern?
I think I do. There's a lot of book reading going on right now, a lot of book clubs and book groups, and but there I think there's a thirst for knowing, well, what do you do with this? This
Mm,
knowledge is great to have, but one of the problems is there's no relationship building going on, or very little, or it's hard and difficult to build relationships between people that are different, and there's a long history of that. There's it's difficult. Whites have a hard time removing the qualities of white supremacy from themselves, the distasteful sense of superiority, the patronizing qualities, the lack of ability to listen and to really attempt to understand the conditions that people have had to face that are not white in this country. I think White Fragility, it's interesting as a book. I still haven't read it. I have it. I finally bought it, and I've looked through little pieces of it, and I've been resistant to it. One of the reasons was because it was so popular among white people. You know, there are definitely academics and others who have looked at the book and criticized it for various reasons. I think it's okay to focus on that fragility, which is a real thing. White fragility is a real thing, but again, it you can be in paralysis by analysis. You can get over. You can think too much about that when really it is. You recognize that whiteness has been put on you, that is really not who you are in your authentic, noble, spiritual self. And you have to find your exit from it. You have to get out from underneath it, and you have to find out where to go. And so that's where I think a lot of white people find themselves now. They're definitely have felt some solid guilt and some shame about learning really the true nature of what whiteness has done to us and how we've been complicit in it. But the step of exiting, which I think the exit is to relationships, the exit is to finding an identity, a new identity that is really maybe more ethnic than it is. Whiteness has no ethnicity to it. Whiteness is just this, it was used, when people came from Europe, they were all kind of eventually lumped together as whites. Of course, Jews were not white at first, and nor were Italians or even the Irish. They eventually were lumped into and whitened to strengthen the power of whiteness against all others. So we have to kind of learn that history, and we haven't been well equipped, I think, and that maybe that's where the fragility comes from. We haven't been well equipped to deal with those truths about ourselves. And so that's what, when I wrote in this haiku, the shame is in that chasm between my truth and my lies. I think this is the disconnect, and this is where we have to find a way to our authentic selves. And so it's because we're even divided within ourselves. It's not just a division from others, but it's a division that is within ourselves. We are not inwardly and outwardly united. We have this. We have it's almost a schizophrenia in a sense. A split
mm,
personality, and we've heard about Du Bois talking about the dual consciousness of black people. There's a similar thing among whites. It's like, who are we? And we've been told we're one thing, but we know that we're something else, right? And so we have to also work this out. For people of color, that dual consciousness has been about survival. But for white people, maybe it is ultimately about survival too. But it's just realizing that what I've been told about myself is not true. That I am not superior to anyone else. I don't have qualities that are better than anyone else. As a matter of fact, most whites are pretty mediocre, in that sense, And there's actually a new book called Mediocrity, which is dealing with white people and mediocrity. In terms of, what I'm saying, Tiffany, if you, for a white person to achieve, they may not have to be as good as for a woman or a black person to achieve. You know what I'm saying? They
right.
because of privilege and entitlement, they can sometimes, doors will open, things will happen for them. And they don't have to have the same sense of excellence often.
Yes. Yes. I've witnessed that for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I say they, and I really mean we. We as people who have been whitened. Yeah. So so I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit on your question, but I think it's really important to find a way to oneness and a new identity. I'm finding that to some degree in the work I'm doing, race unity work with the Baha'i faith, and I mentioned that in my bio that the idea that humanity is one race, we're not divided. Actually, the concept of race is really not scientific at all. There's no scientific basis. We are different, but really we are one human race. And the importance of accepting our differences and finding unity in our difference, which is, I think, some ways the challenge of our time. Is finding union and love and and uh, and unity with our diversity, not despite it, but with it. That it should go along, just like everything in nature works that way. The
Mm-hmm.
wonderful diversity, even the diversity of the human body, all of these different kinds of cells that make up our body. If they didn't work in unity, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. It's they have to find unity for our life.
Yes. I I certainly agree with what you're saying and understand the spirit of it. And I think for me it's my concern or where my question comes from is from a place of efficiency. I there are certain aspects of life, certain challenges in life where I really value efficiency. And
Mm-hmm.
efficiency doesn't mean neglect or dismissal of truth, but I really love to encourage and be a part of like where the rubber hits the road.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I do appreciate what you've shared in your reflections on this process of exiting whiteness or dealing with
Mm-hmm.
white fragility or
Mm-hmm.
whatever we want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
However, I my concern is that people will spend their lifetimes, and I'm not talking about you necessarily, but white people will spend their whole lifetimes in this era just kind of again
Mm-hmm.
ruminating or analyzing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and not possibly not making or taking steps to just simply connect with people of color if they
Yeah.
aren't already
Yeah.
connected. There are plenty of white people who are connected to people of color. They're friends, they're family members,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, people in their communities. So people who they have invested some time already into, and some have some meaningful experiences that they've
Mm-hmm.
shared. So it's not to say I don't certainly don't believe that there are loads of white people who don't have a black friend or a black family member or a black community member or neighbor. I think that, and maybe in different parts of the country that is,
Mm-hmm.
a different experience, but I think more and more as I'm witnessing and experiencing, people are crossing paths, and even beyond that there is more intimacy. I
Right.
think in my experience of this over this last year, it's been more about finding ways to talk with my right friends about what's going on in the country, about related to racial
Mm-hmm.
injustice. And I don't even need to I don't it's not even that I really care about hashing through the details, because I
Mm-hmm.
know that many of them, they understand on some level what's going on
Mm-hmm.
in terms of this, really the feeling that we're not in this together, that we don't actually, that we're not really connected and um, meant to be
Mm-hmm.
intimately connected in our
Yeah.
in every aspect of our lives. It's not that they think that. It's just more about the era. The era is just, I think, makes us all feel a little,
Hmm.
and some of us feel really not great and not happy about the situation, but just even just talking about it, it's challenging, it's hard,
Yeah, it
it's
is.
uncomfortable. But I guess going back to my efficiency, I don't, again, yes, I hope that people in my life who are white
Hmm.
have the basic understanding, basic knowledge of our history and
Hmm.
where we're at now, although I think even where we're at now in our country is complicated. I think, yes, there absolutely, racism is alive and
Hmm.
well. There's also now so much related to class and, wealth
Hmm.
and inequalities.
Yeah.
And that certainly does affect, if we want to call them quote unquote racial
Hmm.
disparities, but it's it's not so much that I need to hash through all that with the white people in my life.
Hmm.
I just really mostly care about our, do we have respect between us? Do we
Hmm.
care about each other? Is there
Hmm.
love? Is there mutuality?
Hmm.
Is uh, there equality? And
Hmm.
I know what that feels like and looks like when those things are present in my
Right. Right.
relationships with white
Right.
people. And I
Hmm.
know when some of that's gone awry.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, where I would speak up if there was a white person in my life where I felt I didn't have that mutuality, that respect, that equality,
Hmm.
that reciprocity.
Hmm.
Um, but to me, it's about the relationships,
Yeah. Yeah.
connecting hearts, connecting on a spiritual level. For me, that's what's valuable. I
Hmm.
understand. I think that that's not for everybody in our country. I think that there seems to be like a survival mode that
Hmm.
we've been in collectively,
Hmm.
humanity has been in since the beginning.
Hmm.
We've evolved. Well, obviously, we've evolved. We've got infrastructure. We've got, communities that
Hmm.
function. Science has evolved, technology has evolved. But there is still this aspect that hasn't totally evolved, which is, what are we doing here together? Why
Yeah.
are we all living here together?
Hmm. Hmm.
Differences and all, challenges and all. No, I don't hear people asking that question.
No.
It's just like, I want to make sure I got what I need. I want to make sure my family has what they need. I get that. Of course, that's
Hmm.
valuable and that's critical. Not at
Hmm.
all dismissing that.
Hmm.
But it seems like collectively we haven't gotten to a place where we haven't gotten to a place where we're actually feeling like we've got our basic needs taken care of. The day to day, everyday struggle is sort of at bay. We feel like we can trust our neighbors.
Hmm.
We're not there collectively. And
No.
so if we can't even get what I feel like are still the basics of
Hmm.
human engagement down, then of course we're not going to be sitting around asking each other, what are we all doing here? Like, how are we supposed to work together? So
Hmm.
I suppose where my concern comes from about asking about this white fragility, exiting whiteness, and
Hmm.
the hamster wheel that I get concerned about is really about going back to something you said. It really is about tapping into authenticity.
Hmm.
Whatever, and you can use whatever words you want, but like, what does it look like for people to have what they need, have the basics covered, feel a sense of comfort?
Hmm.
No, we're not all going to be millionaires and billionaires, but those disparities do need to get smoothed out,
Hmm.
no
Hmm.
doubt. But when we get to a place where we actually are able to just live day to day, not in survival mode.
Hmm.
And I know that when we get there, we'll be able to start to relax and ask the bigger questions that I
Hmm.
think are actually, and I understand you think as well, are
Hmm.
valuable.
Hmm.
And like, what am I doing here? What am I supposed to contribute as a person? And how do I support those around me to contribute to the world, their gifts, their abilities?
Hmm. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't I get that we're just not there collectively yet. And I'm not criticizing it because I'm a part. I really am a part of that process.
Hmm.
I think that that's what I care about and want to encourage people. And obviously, the whole economic disparity is a whole an entirely huge
Mm-hmm.
process
Mm-hmm.
to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because if you're really struggling day to day, which many of us have in different periods of our life, just trying to get the basics and
Mm-hmm.
the stress and anxiety that comes with just trying to make sure you got the basics covered and you got your family covered.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in that mode, I mean, you're not going to sit around and philosophize.
No.
It's
No.
just, I don't expect that
Mm-hmm.
from
Mm-hmm.
myself. I haven't expect that from myself when I've been in rough places, and I don't expect that
Mm-hmm.
from other people. But I think we've got to find the way to tap into that authenticity. Who am
Right.
I, and what wealth do I have inside already?
Mm-hmm.
Not maybe it's not monetarily, obviously, that we're connecting to, but we've got to tap into that wealth of our humanness.
Right.
But we also need to make sure our communities have resources,
Mm-hmm.
have
Mm-hmm.
access to those resources, and are thriving. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big picture thinker. We're still very
Mm-hmm.
much in survival mode, in
Right.
my
Right.
opinion,
Right.
collectively.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. And I don't even care. Even the people who are billionaires and millionaires, there is maybe there are aspects of survival that still permeate our entire
Mm-hmm.
society.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how
Mm-hmm.
much money you have and how much you don't. I know people would say, no, that doesn't jive with me. If you have loads of money, you're not in survival. But survival isn't just about uh it isn't just about having the means to be comfortable. It's also about the mentality,
Mm-hmm.
how you feel about participating in the world. So if you're
Mm-hmm.
always trying to secure, lock down, hold on to, that is survival,
Yeah.
even if you've got billions of dollars. Anyways, I know I've said a lot, but thanks for letting me explore the
No.
idea.
Nice to hear it. Yeah. No, I'm just saying, nice to hear. Nice to hear your thoughts on that. I agree with you. I think we're in a crisis of identity. It's an existential crisis of who we are. Why are we here? What happens to us when we die? I mean, all these questions, which to me all comes back to spiritual. These are spiritual issues, and I know when you use the term spiritual, and I was actually in a discussion recently about this. When we say the world needs to be more spiritual, what is it that we mean? And I think part of it is how we look at ourselves. You know, I was talking about this idea of schizophrenia within ourselves. Are we a material being, or are we a soul? Are we a spirit? Are we a spiritual being? You know, are we both? Right? And but which of those aspects of ourselves should we really identify with as really our reality, as our genuine, authentic, noble self? Right? I think we're going through this process of kind of creating a new identity. I think for me, this is part of the exit from whiteness, is to see myself as a spiritual being first. You know, that once this boat hits the other shore and I burn it, I will not be a man or a white man anymore. No one will retain their color and their gender anymore. We are spiritual beings that are free of both of those things. It's not that we didn't learn from them or that they didn't have value, but as we move on in our spiritual journey, we're going to have to look back and just see the value of it. But that's not really our true identity. We are truly spiritual beings with souls that have amazing capacities. And I think that's part of what unites us. You know, there's a phrase that we are many souls in one body, in a sense, that as humanity's oneness is that we have a spiritual connection with each other. You know, and there's a destiny that we share. There's a civilization that we are building together. You know, civilization marches forward. It is, even in this time of navel gazing, you know, this time of just really thinking about our own selves, it still continues forward. And there are those who are working on community building, and I think community building is a part of moving forward civilization. So it's for me, the exit from both my patriarchy and that training and my whiteness is to find relationships with others who are doing that same work, you know, who are willing to put up with my shortcomings and my ignorance, and yet couched in love, because it really, none of this will change without a sense of love between us. We can move forward. I have had many relationships over the years with wonderful black men who have, we have kind of an agreement that if I do something as a white man that's stupid, I call it going into the stupid room. If I go in the stupid room, will you tell me? Will you please tell me that I did something stupid or said something or I was patronizing or I didn't do something that I should have done? And these relationships have really, really helped me, because those were their comments, and the comments would come and they would sting when I heard them, but they were couched in love. And I knew that it wasn't going to end our relationship, the fact that I did that, because they kind of knew my heart. They knew where I was trying to go and how I was trying to be more authentic to my true self. So I think it's those kinds of relations. It's the same between men and women. There's a lot of mistrust between men and women, and there's lots of reasons for that. But it's there has to be a place and a time when there can be relationships where we can talk honestly about things. Because again, when we're not focused on our spiritual selves, we're focused on our material selves, and that's where everything in the world gets sexualized. Every relationship becomes sexual or potentially sexual, and that changes everything. It's very difficult to have a spiritual, civilization building relationship with someone if it's just bogged down in always this conquest, this sexual conquest, which is so prevalent. And I'm talking a lot about toxic masculinity and hypermasculinity. So it's shifting to a new identity, and I think we have to have beliefs in some of these spiritual realities for us to be able to get there. And as Ferry said, we have to do it together. Whites can't do it by themselves. Reading White Fragility and talking with other white people isn't going to do it. It is in relationship with others where you learn, where you have, you get your rough edges broken off, and you learn and you grow in those kinds of relationships that real transformation can occur. And there just unfortunately is enough of it. I do see places where this is happening, and I encourage people to seek these kinds of places and these groups of people that are being authentic. And it's not easy. I'm in a Baha'i community that is not trying to be exclusive, but is really looking at itself as part of all of the bigger community that is working shoulder to shoulder with all of us on this process of going from adolescence into maturity. Leaving this adolescent kind of materialistic and petty kind of way of looking at things and trying to reach a level of human maturity, which is the next stage in human civilization, is to find a place of maturity. So now I've done my long sermon there.
So I do have a question for you. It's a very direct question about what you shared just a minute ago related to your relationship with blacks and
Hmm.
specifically black men and the intimate relationships that you've cultivated where there is frankness and forthrightness, and where it's, from what I gathered, you said that those men called you out on some
Hmm.
of your whiteness maybe.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm And you said that you, like, sometimes if you'd go into the stupid room, quote unquote, that they'd call you out. What I what I want to ask is, I mean, there are some people, probably a number of white people, if they heard what you said, they would say, "But I don't want to be called stupid, or I don't why do I have
Hmm.
to go around having black people or any pe- people who, are different than me? Why do I have to go around having them call me out?" Like, I think that there are people who that just wouldn't jive with that process.
Hmm.
For you, you shared how it worked for you. It was
Hmm.
humbling,
Hmm.
sometimes a little painful, but that you're able to get clear and get free of some of your misbeliefs maybe or just
Hmm.
missteps. But I think for a lot of white people, or I wonder, I guess really I should say, because I haven't surveyed the white people in America, but I wonder and I have a sense that for
Hmm.
many that just wouldn't jive with them. Like, why do I have to put myself in that place? And maybe that is the battle of the
Hmm.
superiority and complex.
Hmm.
But even if it's not somebody who's really trying to like stake their superiority, but who's just doesn't want to have that kind of dynamic in a
Hmm.
relationship, what
Hmm.
would you say to them, or what or do you see there being other ways of accomplishing the same thing? I'm just
Hmm.
curious.
Hmm. No, I think it's a really good question, Tiffany. It's, I mean, that is where we are. It's, it's that sense of, what are you willing to give up for what it is that we want? I think that humble posture of learning, that idea that we need to be, if we want to grow as human beings, if we want to be authentic as human beings, we have to put ourselves in a place of humility and willingness to listen and to learn from each other. Until we get there, there will not be very much progress. And I think that these qualities are spiritual in nature. They are sometimes counterintuitive to people. It's not how somebody would maybe want to react to someone else, but to forgive, right? To forgive, to have patience, to be willing to listen really deeply. And I've always heard the definition of true listening is to be willing to be changed by what you hear. It's a deep kind of listening, and it's accepting what you hear. I remember one dear friend of mine, Bob James. It's been one of my greatest black mentors, I guess you could say, and working out. And we've often worked together in racial justice work for the last 30 years. We would sometimes talk about how he said I always wondered how it was that you came to where you are as a white person, and my feeling is that the only thing I could say to Bob was, when you told me what was happening, I believed you. I
What do you mean
believed
that
you.
you when he
When
told
you
you about things that you were
well, for example, the
doing?
racist experiences that he had gone through, talking about growing up black in America, just dealing with racism all around him. I didn't go the route where often people go, well, maybe that wasn't it. Maybe it was you were too sensitive. Maybe it was, something else. It wasn't race. It was, it was another issue. Well, when he would say those things, I would just simply believe him because I loved him and I trusted him and he said that this happened to him. Why should I question that? I
Right.
believed and accepted what he said to me. That's the only place I could come to, and I don't know what put that within me, except for a spiritual orientation in my life. Looking at things as a spiritual person, and and also I think there's an opportunity for whites now to really be counter-revolutionaries in the sense of really stepping up as whites and walking into this chasm of division and being willing to really own up to who we are and speak truth. And it's it's still a treacherous. I mean, working around issues of racial justice are always difficult, and there is a lot of talk about people that are virtue signaling. That'll go out just to make themselves look better as a white person. Or to show that they have black friends, or to write BLM on their car window, that kind of stuff. And it's got to be deeper and sincere. And the one thing I do know, Tiffany, and you could tell me if this is true or not, and I think it's also true from a woman's perspective, is you can smell it, you can see it, you can know it if it's true, if it's authentic. There's a sixth sense about it. That is hard to describe where that knowing comes from, but if somebody is sincere or willing to really be sincere, kind of like the idea of the canary in the mine, that you'll smell the gas as a person of color, as a woman, you'll know it. If a guy creeps you out, you know it. There's a feeling. It just like, it just comes, and it's, so I trust that too. I think, there are special abilities and qualities in people that have lived oppressed lives. There are things that happen, and in the Baha'i scripture, there's a lot of discussion about the pupil of the eye. The people of color are the people of the eye of humanity, and that they have the vision. So they're the people of the eye in the body of humanity. They have the vision. And as a white person, that's a bit humbling. But man, I think I revel in that humility, to say, wow, I need to listen. And I think in my life, this has proven to be true, that some of the best guidance and the best help I've had is through friends of color.
Mm. Thank you, Chuck, for sharing the real experiences that you've had. It's not just theory, it's not just your philosophy, but you've been living the life and
Trying to just.
trying to find your way.
Mm-hmm.
Only you can do it in
That's
terms of
right.
your
That's
life. And
and no, we can't do it for anyone else, and
no,
we only can work on ourselves, and it's a hard thing. It's a beautiful thing, though. I think we have to search our hearts.
yes, I think that, yes, absolutely. I also, I suppose what I would want, what the white people who listen to this to hear is that it doesn't, this is my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think that there has to be this like program that white people have to go through.
No.
Like, however you want to do it, however, and the it is, in my mind, coming, stepping up from a place of love, from a place of truthfulness,
Mm-hmm.
and I know some people will say, well, different people see truth differently, but
Yeah.
coming from a place of sincerity, right? Um, in how you speak to people and how you interact with people. Like I don't want people to think they have to go through some sort of boot camp, and then someone stamps their certificate approved.
Mm-hmm.
You've become woke, or you've exited whiteness, or you're good to go now. I mean, I know that for people of color, maybe Black people who interact with white people, friends, families, members, colleagues, neighbors, there is, if there's respect and trust, there is a dynamic where Black people kind of say, okay, yeah, I get it, you're cool, you're um but also, like, people have, I just believe it, anybody, it doesn't, whether we're talking about race consciousness or anything else, like, you still got to do the work to figure out, to hold yourself accountable.
Yes.
In other words, what I'm saying is, I don't think that other people truly can hold you accountable. I mean, yes, society does, like, through the law and through other means, aim to not always successfully hold people accountable. But I think that this personal accountability is where the real power comes from,
Yeah.
if that makes sense, what I'm
No,
trying
no,
to say. And I think
does.
that's why I'm like, white people, please don't feel like you have to find a program that you have to go through and then get the approval of somebody that you're clear. I mean, it's when you have Black friends or family members, neighbors, or people who you just, of color, who you trust, or people of color in general, who are in your lives. I mean, it's through those bonds where and through sincerity, and like a pure heart, pure motives, where I think we all do our best work, regardless of the color of our skin. And I think that's my only concern, is that, like, I don't want there to be any barriers for anybody who's trying to, like, overcome or just get to a place where they feel confident and comfortable in who they are, and that they are and that they believe that they are bringing their best to each day. And white skin or not, like, we all are required to hold ourselves accountable. I mean, if we don't, we don't we don't have trust with anybody. It doesn't really matter if we're
Mhm.
talking about race or not.
Mhm.
So I just want to encourage the idea that it's it's one thing to be ignorant about whatever topic, whatever situation. It's one thing to be ignorant and not have a good heart.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's another thing to be ignorant
Hmm.
simply because you just don't know, you just don't have experience, and you um are just living life and figuring it out like
Right,
the rest of us.
right,
So
right.
I think that the patience that's needed by people of color is
Hmm.
real.
Hmm. No, you're.
I think if you have the really intimate relationships, Black people, white people, where they can, speak truth and
Mhm.
call each other out, so to speak, then wonderful. Not everybody has that kind of dynamic, but if they still are
Yeah.
going to move forward, there's got to be some ounce of patience to allow people to figure things out. But I know that some people have said very recently, I'm done. I'm no more
Hmm.
patience.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
done.
No,
And
I
I and
agree.
I get that, and I have no real, like, I understand it. I
Hmm.
don't have any real pushback except to say, okay, but as long as um as long as we can still find ways to kind of walk with
Hmm.
each other and not feel like we are completely divided. I mean, it's just
Hmm.
it's an interesting balance. I guess that's what
Hmm.
I'm trying to articulate. It's an
No, no,
interesting balance.
it is, and I don't want to imply, because this is an important point, that it isn't the job of people of color to educate white folks. And I think that that's been made clear in a lot of the discussions over the last year since George Floyd's murder, where a lot of people have kind of woken up to this whole issue of race. Unfortunately, so late, but waking up to thinking about the issue of race. Um, it's not. I'm not trying to imply that that's how it has to be, or that there's some special responsibility. I do think, as Ferry said, that the oppressed and the oppressors have to do this together somehow. I'm not sure exactly what form that's always going to take, but I do know that we as whites have to humble ourselves. We have to step off this pillar of superiority. We have to recognize, our faults, our problems, and step aside from those things. I think for me personally, my devotional life is very important. I mean, I pray every day, ask the Creator to help me to humble myself, to better myself, to have the qualities that I need to find friendship and unity, and to be genuine and authentic. And I do this every day. And I think there's also a power in reading of scriptures, whatever background you may come from. But I think that the words of the Creator that are held in many scriptures have a potency and a power that can help and guide us, and in our meditation, in our personal development, because it's difficult to measure these things. But I think if people get into a daily practice of some kind, whatever it may be, now, I'm not a meditator. I know some people like to meditate. I do pray and sit quietly every day, several times a day, thinking about these things, reading, um, and trying to meditate on these words, these powerful words. I mean, we have so much wisdom that we've been given by all of the prophets and teachers that have come to us. Let those things seep into us, and begin to meditate on what those things mean to my life today. These are things I'm trying to do, and I fall so short, and I don't ever mean to imply that I've achieved anything, or that even that I've exited whiteness. I have not exited whiteness. I can see the little bit of speck of light in the distance, maybe, but it's a long journey to get there, and that's okay. I think we have to be patient with ourselves and with the process. I agree. There's no one program. I'm going to read I'm going to read White Fragility and Half That's Never Been Told, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I'm going to read all. And then if I get those books down and I know what's in them, then I'm going to be fine. That's not true. It is in then finding the relationships with people if you can, and sometimes you have to seek them out. I remember we moved into this neighborhood. There was one black family just 2 doors down, and our children were young and their children were young, and I wanted to meet this family and I didn't know quite how to approach. So went down the street with my kids. We kind of played in front of their house until the father came out, and he was kind of like, what are you doing here? We had a little conversation. I tried to connect. Nothing happened. Who is this weird guy? Who is this weird guy? And it wasn't until he drove by my house, and a bunch of our friends, we had moved here to this little town, and a bunch of our friends from a bigger city came, black and white friends, and were in the yard, and he saw black people in front of my house, that he suddenly decided, oh, okay, maybe he's worth making, maybe I can trust him, perhaps. And we very slowly built a relationship, and this is 30 years ago. And we talk about this. He told me really early on, he said, I have to be careful who I make friends with. I've been deeply hurt by white people who I trusted. I go through life kind of like this. When's the next thing going to come down on me? This is what my friend said. And I've learned so much from him, and working together, with him we were both in the NAACP and going out on case calls and things like that. So there's just, I made the effort. It was crude and didn't really work, but it was a start that eventually some trust was built, and now I've got a lifelong friend, or we have a friendship. We can talk about these things anytime. Just I'm so thankful for that.
That's a touching story. I think that's a perfect place to end our conversation.
Okay.
I will, Chuck, ask, as I ask all my guests at the end, I will ask you, what is the TV show you recommend, new or old, and why?
Mm-hmm. You had given me this question in advance, and I couldn't think of something. And I don't know that this quite fits the category, but there's a TV series, which I guess you could say is a show, called Exterminate All the Brutes. And I don't know if you've seen that, but it's on HBO. It's heart-wrenching, heartbreaking, but it's a history of kind of white supremacy as Europeans came to this continent, to North and South America, and what happened, and kind of how it happened. And it's kind of done. It's done as some kind of docudrama a little bit. There are actors involved and play parts and things, but it also is full of really deep factual information. But it's called Exterminate All the Brutes, and there are 4 parts to it. And it's really that's one of a recent show that I've seen that really has stuck out to me. But for fun, I like to. My wife and I love the Swedish detective series called Wallander. It's all in Swedish with subtitles, but he's quite a amazing detective. It's just a good series, and there's an English version which I don't recommend. But the Swedish one is really the one. I think you can get it on Netflix.
Wallander.
Wallander, yes. Wallander.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all pretty much all white folks, pretty much in that. Yeah, in Sweden.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
as it has
As you
been
might
for,
expect. Yeah. Yes, you
for
might
a
expect.
while.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're so welcome, Tiffany. I really appreciate being with you and having this rich discussion. Thank you.
Likewise.